The room hummed with anticipation. The Galactic Coalition summit was in full swing, but no one was truly listening. The Shautari, fierce and militaristic, stood on one side of the table, their bared mandibles clicking impatiently. They demanded control over the Glint mining sector, a vital energy-rich region that could fuel entire war fleets. Their aggressive stance had already made enemies of nearly every faction present. Across the room, the Vernaxises, a species of thinkers, philosophers, and meticulous planners, were locked in an endless debate. Ethical questions about the extraction of resources from Glint plagued their minds, their voices rising in academic fervor. They had no love for the Shautari's military approach, nor their need for more power. And as always, they saw themselves as the enlightened ones, who alone could navigate the delicate balance between progress and ethics. The Kalir, energy-based beings whose existence was intrinsically linked to the manipulation of matter and energy, were far less patient. They vibrated in agitation, flickering with light as they threatened devastation if their emotional and territorial needs were not respected. Their energy, ever fluctuating and unstable, matched their volatile tempers. They were ready to reduce this summit to nothing more than a massive, uncontainable storm if their demands were not met. But the room was eerily silent when the doors slid open, and in walked Ambassador Reinar Solvik of the Earth Union. His calm demeanor contrasted with the charged atmosphere. No one knew much about Solvik. Earth Union had long been dismissed as a quiet player in galactic politics, a faint observer in a galaxy of giants. The humans were still a relatively new addition to the galactic stage, but Solvik's reputation was growing, one small victory at a time. He was known for his strategic mind and unassuming nature, often underestimated by his peers. Yet no one could deny that in every meeting he was always the one with the solution, though he rarely showed his hand early. He stepped into the center of the chamber, his footsteps soft but deliberate. With a practiced hand, he placed his thermos, a nondescript vessel labeled "Definitely Coffee, No Real Entente," the table in front of him. A subtle move, yet one that immediately caught the eyes of the room. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch for a few moments. The factions eyed him warily, the tension thick enough to slice with a blade. Solvik, still unflustered, opened his briefcase. Without a word, he removed a thick binder with the words "Contingency Plans for All Known Galactic Crises" printed in bold letters. He placed it carefully on the table, the heavy thud of it cutting through the air like a bombshell. The chamber grew still, the representatives frozen, their attention fully on the Earth diplomat now standing before them. "Well," Solvik began, his tone calm yet holding a quiet edge that could not be ignored, "I believe it's time we got down to business. You see, Earth Union is often viewed as a minor player in these matters, but I assure you that would be a mistake." He glanced briefly at the Shautari, then the Vernaxis, and finally the Kalir, his gaze unwavering. "We've spent years observing and preparing. We have strategies for any crisis, any conflict you could imagine, and even some you can't." The Shautari leader, Tornik Veller, let out a low growl from across the table, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "What are you implying, human?" His voice was cold, but beneath it, a flash of uncertainty flickered. "Are you suggesting we cannot resolve this ourselves?" Solvik remained unmoved, his hands slowly flipping through the binder. "I'm suggesting that, given the current state of affairs, you might be out of your depth. But don't worry, I've got you covered." A murmur rippled through the room as the Vernex representative, Volak Tharian, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "What exactly do you mean by that? You've come here to lecture us on your contingency plans?" Solvik's lips curled into a slight smile, though it was not one of mockery. It was a smile of quiet confidence. "Not lecture, no. To inform," he corrected, taking a slow sip from his thermos before setting it down carefully. "You see, I've been listening to you all argue for the past hour. You all think you're solving a problem, but I can already tell you're too focused on the wrong things. You're all reacting to your emotions, your egos, and your fears." His eyes swept over each faction, lingering momentarily on each. The Kalir twitched, their energy fields fluctuating erratically as their leader, Lator Azrix, attempted to maintain control. "You are asking for solutions," Solvik continued. "But none of you have thought about what happens when everything goes wrong. None of you have prepared for the worst." He paused for a moment, letting the silence grow heavy. "Well, Earth Union has. And we're ready to present a solution for every single one of you." There was no more debate about the Glint mining sector or the Shautari's demands. Solvik had taken control of the summit, his casual confidence slowly undermining the carefully crafted posturing of the factions. Even the Vernaxes, typically so dismissive of anything not wrapped in intellectual rigor, found themselves captivated by the simplicity of Solvik's approach. A soft hum began to build in the background as the Kalir leader Lator Azrix finally spoke. "So, what exactly do you propose, human?" Solvik turned a page in his binder. "We've already prepared countermeasures for your aggression, your ethical debates, and your territorial demands. For the Shautari, we have a simple method for neutralizing your most dangerous emotions. For the Vernaxes, we've prepared philosophical puzzles that will break your deadlock. And for the Kalir, we have a solution that speaks directly to your sensory needs. No weapons, no threats. Just a way to force cooperation." The room stilled again. Solvik's words were not the empty promises of a minor player. They were the measured statements of someone who had already won the game, even before it began. "I assure you," he continued, his voice still calm, "Earth Union has prepared for every possible outcome, and unlike the rest of you, we've already made sure that we won't fail." With that, he closed the binder and gave a small, satisfied nod. "Now, shall we proceed to the next issue?" The tension in the room was palpable, but it wasn't fear of the conflict anymore. It was the dawning realization that Earth Union, this small, unassuming faction, was the one truly in control. Solvik's calm presence had done what none of the factions had expected. He had seized the summit, not with force, but with the quiet certainty that Earth had already thought of everything they had not. Ambassador Solvik's fingers brushed lightly across the surface of his thermos. The faint clink of metal against the cold table was the only sound in the room, yet it felt like an echo inside the massive chamber. Despite the chaos bubbling at the summit's core, Solvik seemed to stand apart from it, the silence around him thick and heavy. The factions had only just begun to understand the depth of his calm. Tornik Villar of the Shautari was the first to break the stillness. His voice, low and clipped, was thick with the scent of impatience. "You cannot be serious," he spat, his tone cold but edged with something deeper, something that could almost be described as fear. "You think these contingency plans are enough to stop us?" The other representatives stiffened, their gazes flicking between Villar and Solvik. The Shautari's militaristic posture was unmistakable. Sharp mandibles, shoulders squared, eyes narrowed with suspicion. This was the species that waged war to settle every dispute, and now they were being asked to reconsider their stance. By a human? Solvik's eyes remained unfocused, yet his posture was impeccable, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "I'm not asking you to reconsider your goals, Villar," he replied, his voice soft but steady. "I'm asking you to reconsider your methods." The Shautari leader opened his mouth to retort, but Solvik continued, his words flowing like a quiet river that couldn't be stopped. "A battle fought with aggression will end with destruction. A battle fought with patience will end with control." There was a ripple of tension among the factions, but none of them spoke. Solvik wasn't here to brawl for dominance. He was here to outthink them all. The Vernaxes, always so focused on logic, had been mulling over the ethics of resource extraction for hours. They debated endlessly, trapped by their own need for justification, their intellectual processes paralyzing their decision-making. Volok Tharian, the leader of the Vernaces, adjusted his glasses, his voice tinged with skepticism. "You misunderstand, Solvik. The ethics of this dispute are not negotiable. The extraction cannot proceed without full consideration of its consequences." His words were as much an assertion as they were a question, an attempt to remain the intellectual superior in a room of chaotic emotions. But Solvik was not deterred by their intellectual high ground. He did not need to defeat them with logic. He had something far more effective at his disposal: their own weaknesses. "No," Solvek responded quietly, his eyes now meeting Tharian's gaze. "You misunderstand. It's not about the ethics of extraction. It's about understanding the tension your ethics create." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, and addressing it. The Kalir, their energy bodies flickering with intensity, shifted uneasily. Lator Azrix, their leader, exhaled a light hiss, his form wavering between solid and vapor. His energy field pulsed erratically in the silence. "And what of us, Solvik?" Azrix's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, as if the very air around him might shatter under the weight of his emotions. "What is Earth's answer to our demand?" Solvik nodded, as though expecting the question. He raised his hand slowly, not to signal them, but to still the growing chaos in the room. "For you, Azrix," he began, "we've devised something simple, yet profound. An adjustment to your perception, a way to calibrate your energy without an outburst." The Kalir leader's energy signature flickered uncertainly. Solvik continued. "A photonic calibration system, designed to manage the fluctuations in your energy fields. No weapons, no force. Just a tool for understanding, for stabilizing your emotional response." The room fell into complete silence. For the first time since the summit had begun, each faction looked at each other, considering not just the words that had been spoken, but the implication behind them. Solvik's proposal wasn't just a weapon of control, it was a deep, psychological play. He was taking their most volatile emotions, their most pressing conflicts, and turning them into a chessboard. He was playing with them, making them pause, making them think. The Shautari bristled at the thought of manipulation, of being forced into a different way of thinking, but it was not the forceful confrontation they expected. The pulse of fear ran through them, yet they were forced to look within and question their impulse to strike. The Vernaxes, too, felt something shift in the air. Their tendency toward philosophical debate, grounded in their desire for righteousness, was being met with something far more unsettling than mere words. "How is this possible?" Thario finally whispered, his voice almost betraying his usual control. Solvik looked around at them all, his calm demeanor unshaken. "It's possible because Earth Union has always been watching. We have observed, learned, and anticipated every possible reaction you might have. From your aggression to your intellectual paralysis to your emotional volatility, we've already prepared for all of it." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle like dust in the air. "And now, we are presenting you with the solution." The air seemed thicker now, as though each breath was laden with more than just oxygen. It was the weight of realization, the quiet understanding that Earth, despite its relatively modest position in the galaxy, had somehow managed to outwit them all. The Shautari, who thought their aggression was their strength, now had to consider their own emotions. The Vernaxes, whose pride in their intellect had carried them for eons, now faced the unsettling possibility that their precious logic might not be enough to solve this conflict. And the Kalir, for all their power, had their vulnerabilities laid bare. Solvik could feel their collective uncertainty in the room. Their emotions, uncertainty, fear, anger, rippled in the atmosphere. Yet his presence, calm as a still lake, reflected none of it. "I'll be back in a moment," Solvik said, his voice low and deliberate. "But in the meantime, I suggest you all consider what we've just discussed." And with that he closed the binder with a sharp snap. The factions remained still, their thoughts swirling, their next moves uncertain. The calm before the storm had arrived, and it was not Earth that was going to feel its wrath. Solvik allowed the silence to settle, its weight tangible, the tension almost a physical presence in the room. The Shautari, their sharp mandibles clicking in irritated rhythm, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had been prepared for a negotiation, for an agreement by force if necessary. They did not deal in diplomacy. They fought, they conquered, and they subjugated. And yet, here was this human, cool as ice, presenting something far more unsettling than weapon. Tornik Valar, the Shautari leader, was the first to break the stillness. his voice laced with scorn. Do you think this game of yours will hold us back? His words sliced through the room, sharp and jagged. These emotional tools? You may manipulate thoughts, but you cannot manipulate us. The others in the room, ever watchful, leaned in. The tension was suffocating, each alien species sitting on the precipice of war. Valar, undeterred by the hum of Solvik's quiet confidence, stood tall, his posture rigid. The Shautari resolve disputes the only way we know how, by force. Nothing else matters. Solvik's calm gaze never wavered. You're right, he replied softly. Force is one way. But tell me, Valar, how many times has it worked for you without cost? The Shautari leader hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Solvik's words weren't accusations but calculated precision. It was a slight push, a prod at their deepest flaw. Overconfidence. The Shautari were prepared for war, but not for what Solvik had in store. Meanwhile, the Vernaxes were sinking deeper into themselves. They debated amongst one another, philosophers trapped by their own ideals. Their intellectualism, which had served them so well for millennia, now worked against them. Volek Tharion, their leader, stood frozen in thought, his hands steepled in front of his face. He was not afraid, but rather paralyzed by the implications of Solvik's psychological play. Could these manipulations be ethical? Could they allow themselves to be calibrated in such a way? Tharion finally spoke, voice tinged with skepticism. You would use such tools on our minds? You would tamper with our philosophies? This, he gestured at the room, at the situation, is beyond your understanding, human. The very idea of emotional recalibration is beneath us. Solvik's eyes flicked toward him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his lips. And yet, here you are, he said, voice carrying the weight of a challenge. Debating something as simple as this, caught in the endless loop of your own philosophy. The question isn't whether it's beneath you, Volak. The question is, why are you so unwilling to let go? The Vernaxes paused, and for a brief moment they saw the truth in Solvik's words. Their own hesitation was their greatest flaw. They were so consumed by their need to be right, to find the ethical path, that they had failed to see the solution when it was right in front of them. Solvik turned his attention to the Kalir, whose energy fields pulsed erratically as they responded to the escalating tension. The Kalir, beings of pure energy and emotion, had a unique vulnerability. Their power was drawn directly from their emotional state, a fact that Solvik had observed for years. They were dangerous because they felt everything. Too much emotion, and their form would destabilize. Too little, and their connection to reality would fracture. Lator Azrix, the Kalir leader, quivered in their incorporeal form. They were neither fully solid nor entirely ethereal, their energy wavering as they hissed in anger. You think we need your manipulations? You think you can control us with your light? Azrix's voice was raw, a reverberation of pure emotion. Solvik's face remained unchanged as he stepped forward, his every movement deliberate. I don't need to control you, Azrix. I need you to understand what you need. And with that, he activated the photonic calibration system, a subtle, almost imperceptible signal, a flash of light dancing across the room. On a laser plasma display, the Kalir's energy readings shifted in response, their bodies reacting to the pulses as though guided by an invisible hand. The Kalir recoiled at first, their energy flux momentarily out of sync with their surroundings. But then, something shifted. Slowly, their chaotic pulses began to align with the rhythm of the light, their energy stabilizing under the gentle influence of Solvik's design. Azrix let out a low hiss, their energy shifting again, but this time in a controlled manner. What is this? They trembled, their energy coiling around the light's rhythm like a serpent bound by an unseen force. Solvik smiled, a sharp, knowing smile that betrayed no emotion other than the quiet satisfaction of having achieved his first success. It's not manipulation, Azrix. It's understanding. The Kalir's reaction was the first real sign of success. The tension in the room seemed to loosen ever so slightly, the air shifting from fraught with potential destruction to something more akin to uncertainty. The Kalir were confused, their emotions fluctuating wildly as they tried to process what had just happened. But in that confusion was an opening, a crack in their previously unyielding defenses. Volak Tharian spoke again, his voice now a hesitant murmur. "But you're still tampering with our minds, aren't you?" Solvik's expression softened for a moment, though his words held their usual precision. "No, Volak, I'm offering you a choice. Control or chaos. You all have the option to step away from your primal impulses and think. For once." The room was still. The Shautari were no longer posturing, though they still bristled with uncertainty. The Vernaxes had been given a puzzle, a challenge they were struggling to resist, and the Kalir, they were caught in a new unsettling experience. Their energy, once so wild, was now calm, their chaotic minds forced to reckon with the methodical precision of Earth's tactics. Solvik's voice broke the silence, once again calm and unwavering. "This is just the beginning. We have prepared for every response, and we will wait." And so the faction sat in silence, the tension broken not by force or violence, but by the quiet precision of human strategy. The tension in the summit room was palpable now, each faction visibly strained, their collective facade of unity cracking under Solvik's steady, deliberate pressure. No one had expected this. The human envoy was not here for a simple negotiation, he was here to reshape the entire table. The room, once filled with the sharp, invasive voices of the Shautari, Vernaxis, and Kalir, now hung in the balance, their emotions carefully tethered by Solvik's silent strategy. Tornik Velar, the Shautari leader, stood rigid. His mandibles clicked, their sharp edges cutting through the thick air as his gaze shifted between Solvik and the other factions. There was no question in his mind. Earth was playing a dangerous game. Yet he couldn't dismiss it. Not with the way Solvik's calm presence seemed to be forcing them into a corner. He had expected the human to back down, to cower under the weight of galactic pressure. But there Solvik stood, unaffected, the weight of an entire universe seeming to crush the space between them. "You think we will fall in line with your games?" Velar's voice was low, the warning edge of anger just beneath the surface. "Earth has no place here, and certainly no authority to challenge the likes of us." Solvik didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the Shautari. Instead, his eyes wandered across the room, as though the Shautari were not even worthy of his direct attention. "What if I were to remind you, Velar, that honor has a price, and that price is often overestimated?" Velar's jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring. He was a creature of emotion, every movement a reflection of his instincts. The way Solvik's words unraveled the delicate threads of Shautari pride left him unsure, his resolve beginning to waver. Solvik had found the crack, and he had applied just the right amount of pressure. Meanwhile, the Vernaxes found themselves caught in a far more insidious trap. The philosophers among them were trapped by their own over-analysis. They could see the logic in Solvik's approach, but the ethical implications of manipulating emotions and energy so precisely gnawed at them. Volak Tharian, the Vernaxes' leader, furrowed his brow, his tentacles twitching with suppressed agitation. The debate among his people had already begun to spiral into disarray, each member adding to the growing intellectual turmoil. They were torn between their respect for Solvik's cunning and their commitment to the idea of pure philosophy. "I don't understand," Tharian said slowly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Is this what diplomacy has come to? The manipulation of thoughts, emotions, energy? This is not the path we have followed for millennia." Solvik's gaze met Tharian's, calm and unwavering. "Then why are you still debating, Volak? Why not simply act?" The words struck deep. Solvik wasn't just questioning their methods, he was questioning their very foundation. It wasn't manipulation they feared. It was being shown the hollowness of their intellectual pursuit. Their endless thinking had paralyzed them. The philosophical puzzle Solvik had introduced now twisted like a thorn in their minds, refusing to let them settle into their usual certainty. They were trapped by their own intellectualism. Thorian began, but his voice faltered, the words not coming as they had before. The others in his faction hesitated, and in that moment, the philosophical walls they had built for centuries seemed to crumble, leaving them with nothing but uncertainty. And then there were the Kalir, whose emotional charge pulsed like a silent storm in the air. Their very existence was tied to their volatile energy, their strength drawn from deep within their emotions. Solvik had already begun to shift the balance with the Kalir, their chaotic energy now under his subtle influence. The Morse code light system was in place, and the initial signs of success were undeniable. But even now, Lator Azrix, the leader of the Kalir, was unwilling to fully accept this form of manipulation. Azrix's energy fluctuated wildly, an ebbing current of waves that threatened to break the carefully constructed calm Solvik had engineered. "You would use light against us?" Azrix's voice was sharp, charged with the weight of their nature. "You think light can control what we are? We exist in energy, not mere photons." Solvik's response was measured, his voice a quiet hum in the growing tension. "I think you've forgotten how deeply light is a part of your existence. You see, Lathor, it's not about controlling you. It's about inviting you to see the truth of your own existence, a language you already understand." The light flashed again, precise and deliberate, the system Solvik had set in motion engaging the Kalir's photonic senses in ways they had never experienced. The effect was subtle but undeniable. Their chaotic energy, so often unpredictable, began to stabilize under the influence of the light. Their reactions slowed, their frantic pulses no longer as erratic. Azrix's form flickered, the Kalir uncertain in their energy expression. They had been forced into submission without the need for a direct confrontation. They were recalibrating their understanding of themselves, and they didn't know how to respond. The silence that followed was deafening. Solvik stood at the center, his expression as calm as ever, as if nothing had happened. He had broken the chaotic tides of emotion that had once controlled the room, forcing the factions into a hesitant pause, a moment of reflection they had not anticipated. Volok Tharian turned to the Kalir, his voice uncertain but tinged with an intellectual curiosity he had not felt moments before. They've calmed," he said quietly. "How did he—" Azrix interrupted, their energy flickering erratically once more. "This isn't over. This isn't control. This is—" Their voice cut off, unsure, as they struggled to make sense of their own reaction. Solvik's words interrupted the growing confusion. "You're correct, Azrix. This isn't about control. It's about choice. And you've all been given a choice. Control your emotions, or be consumed by them. The path ahead is for you to walk." The Kalir, once so sure of their emotional dominance, now stood on the precipice of something far more subtle, a battle they had not seen coming. The Shautari, whose pride had once been so strong, now found themselves questioning their obsession with honor. The Vernaxes no longer held their intellectual superiority with certainty, and the Kalir, their energy had been tempered, shaped in a way they couldn't fully understand. As the summit room simmered with quiet uncertainty, Solvik let the silence linger for just a moment longer. The factions were fractured now, their unified front shattered. They had been forced to reconsider their place in the universe, not through force, but through psychological warfare, a slow, deliberate push to the edge of their own self-awareness. For Earth, it was just the beginning. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, suffocating the room as the final threads of restraint between the factions began to unravel. The Shautari, once brimming with militaristic confidence, were now fighting an unseen war inside themselves. Their aggressive stance had faltered under the weight of Solvik's calculated moves, and their honor, something they cherished more than their very lives, had become their greatest vulnerability. Tornik Velrar, the Shautari leader, paced in front of the display panel, his eyes narrowed into a furious glare. His claws scraped against the floor with each measured step, his frustration palpable. He could feel the weight of Solvik's presence bearing down on him, like an invisible force that held him in place. For the first time in decades, Velrar's confidence wavered. "Enough of this," Velrar growled, his voice filled with barely contained rage. "You think you can manipulate us, turn us into your pawns?" His mandibles clicked loudly in the silence that followed, their sharp edges shining in the harsh lights. "We've fought for centuries, and now this human, this diplomat, dares to undermine everything we stand for?" Solvik's eyes remained fixed on Velrar. He didn't speak, only watched as the Shautari leader's energy shifted from arrogance to something akin to doubt. There was no need for words. Solvik knew the psychological fracture was already in motion. The Shautari had been so certain of their superiority, and yet here they stood, confused, their pride crippled by a method they had never expected. Diplomacy without a single shot fired. Without acknowledging Velar's words, Solvik turned his attention to the Vernaxis. The philosophers, once immersed in their debates, now seemed trapped by their own intellectualism. Volek Tharian, the Vernaxis leader, was visibly strained, his tentacles twitching erratically. His people had long prided themselves on their superior intellect, and yet the puzzle Solvik had posed to them, the very core of the ethical dilemma, had begun to eat away at their confidence. "I don't know what's worse," Tharian murmured to himself, voice tinged with disbelief. "The idea that we are being outthought by a race so young, or that we are standing here, questioning our own values because of a human." Solvik, ever the unshaken presence, spoke softly. "Philosophy has its place, Volak, but it's also a tool for those who hide behind it. I've shown you how easily you've been manipulated by your own overthinking. You sought to find a flaw in my plan, but in doing so, you've overlooked the one thing that matters most: action." Tharian's jaw tightened, and for a moment his gaze flickered to the other leaders. He couldn't deny it anymore. Solvik had used their very principles against them. Their endless analysis had been their own downfall. Across the room, Lator Astrix, the leader of the Kalir, stood in a rare moment of stillness. The once chaotic energy of his people had settled, a direct result of the light system Solvik had introduced to recalibrate their energy-based senses. The Kalir had been thrown into confusion, unable to process this subtle form of manipulation that wasn't based on aggression or force. Azrix's form flickered, his energy shifting in uncertain patterns, as if trying to break free from the hold Solvik had placed on their senses. The Kalir had never been subject to such an emotional recalibration. They were creatures of pure energy, used to controlling their surroundings. Yet here they were, caught in a web of light signals they couldn't fully comprehend. You've tampered with us." Astrix's voice trembled, though it was a voice of awe more than anger. "Your light." "It isn't tampering, Lator," Solvik interjected calmly, his voice smooth and deliberate. "It's simply guiding your senses in a way that aligns with your nature. I didn't force you. I simply gave you a choice. Continue on the path of chaos or find equilibrium. You've done neither yet, but the path is clear." For the first time, Ascrix hesitated. They had been forced to confront their own limitations, something no other faction had ever done to them. The realization was slow, creeping over the Kalir like an insidious fog. Earth had not defeated them with weapons or sheer force. Instead, they had reshaped their reality with a quiet, confident mastery. Velar's voice interrupted the stillness. "We've been patient," he said, his voice rising, each word thick with frustration. "But patience is running out. You," he pointed at Solvik, his claw trembling with barely contained fury, "you've played your hand, but we are not the ones who will break first." A tense silence followed. The Shautari were desperate now, not just for victory, but for redemption in their own eyes. But Solvik, for all his quiet diplomacy, had led them to this point. where every faction was questioning their beliefs, their priorities, and their place in the galaxy. As the silence stretched, the heads-up display flickered to life. The map of the Glint mining sector flashed before them, showing the coveted energy resources. The tension was unbearable now, every leader on edge, anticipating what would come next. Solvik calmly stepped forward, his figure illuminated in the sharp, shifting light. His voice, when it came, was soft, but carried the weight of the entire summit. "Tell me," he asked, his tone unwavering, "do you believe that a war fought with energy will yield a peaceful future? Or can you see that this conflict, this entire summit, has been an exercise in finding the common thread, the point where we all converge?" He let the question hang in the air, unspoken answers swirling in the minds of the leaders. The factions, once so certain of their right to control the galaxy, now stood frozen in place, unable to act without first confronting the very tools they had used to justify their power. The war they had been prepared to wage, one of force, one of dominance, suddenly seemed far more fragile than they had ever considered. Solvik, in his quiet confidence, had shifted the balance irrevocably. And for Earth Union, it was no longer a question of whether they could hold their ground. The question was now, who would break first? The room held its breath, the calm before the storm that Solvik had with masterful precision orchestrated. The summit hall, once filled with the heat of battle, now stood eerily still. The factions that had once bickered and postured, each claiming its rightful place at the top of the galactic hierarchy, sat in quiet reflection. The intense glare of overhead lights now seemed to mock them, casting long shadows across the faces of the leaders who, only hours before, had been on the verge of annihilating one another. Solvik had not fired a single shot, and yet, in the space of one carefully crafted summit, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The Shoutari were the first to react. Villar, still as formidable as ever, stood rigid, his talons clenched into tight fists. His every movement was controlled, a man forcing himself to remain calm despite the seething fury beneath. The other members of his faction shifted uneasily around him, the unspoken tension palpable. "We've been outmaneuvered," Villar finally muttered, his voice low, betraying the anger he struggled to suppress. His words were not directed at Solvik, but at his own people. This isn't just a diplomatic maneuver, it's a warning. A declaration that Earth is not just playing at diplomacy, they've already moved beyond our tactics. How are we to face them? Toron, his second in command, exchanged a glance with the others, but his expression was unreadable. "We were unprepared," he said, his voice devoid of the usual Shoutari arrogance. "Their tools aren't weapons in the traditional sense. We know how to fight wars, but this is something else." Solvik's soft smile lingered in the back of their minds. It was that smile that had unnerved them, the quiet confidence that spoke not of brute strength, but of careful calculation. Earth, once a fledgling power, had shown its true potential, to bring a galaxy to its knees, not through violence, but through the manipulation of minds, of emotions, and of senses. Meanwhile, in the far corner of the room, the Vernaxes stood in a far less assured state. Their philosophical nature, once their greatest strength, had become a weakness. The intellectuals of their faction, who had been adamant in their ethical objections to the method Solvik had proposed, now found themselves trapped by their own arguments. The ethical puzzle Solvik had presented to them had proved far more effective than any weapon, dismantling their convictions piece by piece. "Do you see it now?" Volok Tharian's voice was a harsh whisper, barely audible above the hum of the cooling system. His tentacles twisted in agitation. Solvik wasn't trying to convince us with reason. He knew we would become tangled in our own thoughts. He knew we would second-guess our moral compass until we didn't know which way was true. The philosophical debate had turned into a trap of their own making. They had walked into it willingly. And now Tharian could feel the defeat creeping in, an intellectual defeat more complete than any physical blow could have been. The Vernaxes had been too caught up in the pursuit of theoretical perfection to recognize that Solvik's true weapon was not in his words, but in his understanding of their very nature. We have to confront the consequences of our own thinking, Tharian continued, his voice raw. We've been outplayed, not by military strength, but by a species that understands the complexity of our minds better than we do. It's going. There was no retort from the others. They had no answers. The debate was over. The intellectual walls they had built to protect their culture now felt like shackles, tying them to an intellectual trap that they could not escape from. The weight of their own indecision pressed upon them like a suffocating fog. And then, the Kalir. The beings of pure energy, once so certain of their superiority, shifted uneasily. Their leader, Azrix, stood at the far end of the room, his form fluctuating with pulses of energy. But there was a subtle change in the rhythm of his energy field. Solvik's manipulation of their senses, though unseen, had struck deep. Their power lay in their ability to control matter and energy, but now they were being forced to confront a new reality. They were not as invincible as they had believed. We have been miscalculated. Azrix's voice was almost a whisper, the energy pulses emanating from his body warping in response to his words. His people, once an overwhelming force, now found themselves questioning everything they had taken for granted. This human, he doesn't fight us in the way we know. He's taken our greatest asset, our understanding of energy, and turned it against us. The Kalir had always believed that their mastery over energy made them untouchable. But now, they were the ones who were out of balance, their energy pulses faltering as they tried to process the subtle, psychological manipulation Solvik had employed. His method was clear now. He had not sought to overpower them physically, but had instead adapted to their way of being, controlling them through the very senses they relied on for survival. As the factions settled into a tense silence, the Earth Union sat in the midst of it all, their quiet triumphs felt but unspoken. Solvik had done what no one thought possible. With each faction in disarray, their leaders questioning their own values and methods, Earth stood at the precipice of a new era in galactic politics. The final blow had not been a strike of military force. It had not been a decisive assault or a calculated offensive. It had been something much subtler. The unraveling of minds, the bending of perspectives, and the shifting of the very foundation of galactic power. Solvik's calm was now more than just a demeanor. It was a force of nature. And in the quiet aftermath of the summit, the factions were left to reckon with the fact that Earth, once a pawn in the grand chessboard of the galaxy, had now become its most dangerous player, not through violence, but through intelligence, patience, and foresight. The aftermath of the summit was eerily silent. The once bustling chamber, where emotions had run as high as the stakes, was now a cavern of quiet contemplation. The factions had retreated to their corners, each leader still reeling from the cascade of events that had unfolded under their noses. Earth Union, once an unlikely player, had shifted the balance of power, without so much as raising a hand in aggression. The hue of the laser plasma displays in the corners of the room now seemed almost mocking, a faint echo of the chaos that had filled the air just hours ago. Reinar Solvik stood at the edge of the hall, his expression unreadable as the leaders of the galactic factions mulled over the day's revelations. It was not a victory to be shouted from the rooftops, but one that rested quietly within the folds of the Earth Union's strategies, its intellect, and its careful, calculated moves. He was not one for grand gestures, and as he watched the various leaders, their postures guarded and uncertain, he wondered if they would ever fully grasp the weight of the gambit they had just lost. The Shautari, once so sure of their strength, now seemed unsure of their footing. Valar's sharp angular features were softer, his posture stiffer, and though his talons still twitched in agitation, there was an underlying uncertainty in his voice when he spoke to his generals. We were outmaneuvered, not by force, but by ideas, by patience. This, Earth Union, they understand our minds before we even have the chance to act. His words were tinged with a mixture of respect and bitter realization. The warlike ferocity that once drove his people, now tempered by the quiet weight of intellectual defeat. We were too eager, Toron, one of Valar's closest advisors, muttered from beside him, his mandibles twitching with tension. We assumed that a show of strength would bring them to heel. But Earth, they did not even need to raise their weapons. They defeated us with a look, with a pause in their speech. The realization settled between them like a stone. The Shautari, creatures of honor and war, had not considered that the greatest weapon could be something as subtle as anticipation, as quiet as thought. Their relentless pursuit of victory had blinded them to the fact that there was more to war than just physical might. Their own aggression, their posturing, had played right into Solvik's hands. Elsewhere in the room, the Vernexi stood in a similar intellectual disarray. The philosophers and scholars of their faction, once so proud of their ability to analyze every scenario, were now at a loss. Their once sharp minds were dulled by the realization that they had walked into a trap of their own making. The last week, I thought we had seen everything. Volvac Tharion's voice broke the silence, his tentacles flicking with agitation. But Solvik's tactics, they were not based on logic, at least not in the way we understand it. He turned our greatest asset, our reason, against us. His eyes narrowed as he glanced at his colleagues. We were too caught up in our own philosophy to recognize the simplicity of his method. Disrupt us, and we would lose ourselves in our thoughts. His puzzle was more than just a test of intellect, one of the Venaxi philosophers remarked, his voice heavy with defeat. It was a challenge to our identity, to our purpose. He knew how to make us question ourselves, our very foundation. Their attempts to counter Solvik's subtle maneuvering had crumbled in the face of his insight into their nature. The Vernaxes were defeated not by a weapon, but by the overwhelming weight of their own ideas. Their confidence, built on years of intellectual dominance, now lay in ruins. And then there were the Kalir, the energy beings who once believed their control over matter and energy made them the most powerful force in the galaxy. Azrix, the leader of their faction, stood apart from the others, his form flickering with an unsettling pulse. The fluctuating energy signature around him spoke volumes of the disarray now coursing through his people. Their physical abilities, their command over the elements of the universe, had once given them an unshakable sense of superiority. But Earth's subtle, quiet approach had exposed a fundamental flaw. They anticipated us. Azric's voice crackled, his energy flickering as if even his form was struggling to process the events. Not just our emotions, but the very way we perceive the universe, the way we interact with energy. They disrupted that balance. We will never have the advantage again, one of the Kalir's advisors murmured, his form undulating in frustration. Not when they can alter the very way we sense the universe, the way we respond to stimuli. We have no defense against that. Azric's energy fluctuated, unsure whether to surge or to subside. We are left exposed. Earth has seen us for what we are, and they have taken control of the one thing we thought we could always rely on, our senses, our perception of reality. The room had grown colder, the air heavier with the weight of realization. The Earth Union, once a small player on the galactic stage, had shifted the tides of power, through intellect, through quiet mastery, and through their ability to understand and manipulate the very emotional triggers that drove the galaxy's most powerful species. No shots had been fired, no explosions had rocked the chamber, and yet, the very foundation of galactic politics had been shaken. In the quiet aftermath, Solvik stood among the factions, his presence not as a victor, but as a quietly calculating force. His mind worked not to dominate, but to guide, to subtly shift the balance of power without force. He had outmaneuvered the greatest minds of the galaxy, not with sheer strength or brash diplomacy, but by understanding the very essence of each species. He had played the long game, and now the galaxy was left to reckon with the quiet power of Earth Union. The leaders of the factions, each standing in their own internal silence, could not yet decide whether to fear Earth or to admire it. They were trapped in a paradox of their own making. Earth had shown them that it was not brute strength that ruled the galaxy, but the quiet ability to anticipate, to control, and to outthink. But one thing was certain: they would never view Earth Union the same way again. The summit had ended. but the ripples it caused would be felt for years to come. The once fractured and chaotic chamber now lay still, the quiet hum of laser plasma displays serving as a faint reminder of the intensity that had gripped the room just hours before. The factions of the galaxy, each powerful in its own right, now stood at a crossroads, forced to reconcile with a new reality. Earth Union had emerged as the new center of galactic diplomacy. Reinar Solvik stood at the edge of the room, his sharp eyes watching the various factions retreat into their private councils. His face betrayed little emotion, but his mind was already calculating the aftermath. The universe was no longer the same. Earth's quiet but undeniable strength had turned the tides of galactic politics. The subtle art of diplomacy had taken a new form, and it was now Earth's to shape. The Shautari, once fierce and proud, were no longer the unchallenged warriors of the galaxy. They now shuffled through their thoughts, their pride bruised by their defeat in the psychological battlefield. Villar, once so confident in his species' dominance, now found himself standing in a corner of the summit hall, the light from the plasma displays casting long shadows over his face. He spoke to his generals in low, harsh tones, words tinged with uncertainty. "We have underestimated them," he growled, the sharpness of his voice betraying the internal conflict now roiling inside him. "Earth, their strength lies not in weaponry, but in patience, in anticipation." His commanders nodded in agreement, yet their eyes lacked the spark they once had. The Shautari had always been a species built on honor and aggression, but the realization that they had been outmaneuvered without a single shot fired was a bitter pill to swallow. On the opposite side of the room, the Vernaxes found themselves locked in intellectual turmoil. Their philosophers, who once prided themselves on their ability to debate and reason their way through any crisis, now sat in stunned silence. They had been bested not by the intellect of a peer, but by the raw simplicity of a mind that understood human nature, Earth's nature. Solvik had manipulated their ethical codes not through force, but by presenting a challenge they could not ignore. Their intellectual foundations had been shaken, leaving them unsure of their next move. Tharion, the leader of the Vernaxes delegation, paced back and forth, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. "He outwitted us," he muttered to himself. "Not with logic, but with something more, something beyond our understanding. Earth didn't just counter our arguments, they turned them against us." He paused, a sigh escaping his lips. "Can we even trust our own philosophy now?" The Kalir had the most direct confrontation with Solvik's methods. As beings of pure energy, they had always believed their control over the elements made them the most advanced of the factions. They had underestimated Earth's ability to not only anticipate their actions, but to manipulate their very perception of reality. Azrix, their leader, had felt the full brunt of Earth's psychological tactics. No amount of raw power could have prepared the Kalir for the subtlety of Solvik's manipulation of their energy-based nature. Azrix's form shimmered, his energy signature fluctuating in a way that spoke volumes of his confusion and growing respect. "We are not the dominant force we believed we were," he whispered, the flicker of his being betraying the weight of his realization. "They saw us not as conquerors, but as creatures of habit, and they made us question that habit." The Kalir had been thrown off balance by a single, simple maneuver: Solvik's use of light. Earth's ability to engage their photonic-based consciousness had disrupted everything they thought they knew about their place in the galaxy. They were not invulnerable, nor were they the supreme force they had once believed. Earth had forced them to reconsider their entire existence, and, for the first time in centuries, the Kalir questioned their position atop the galactic hierarchy. Across the room, Solvik remained calm, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze unwavering. He could feel the weight of the room's attention on him, but he did not flinch. This was the moment he had anticipated, the moment when Earth's quiet strategy would fully come to fruition. He had not fought with weapons or bombs, but with ideas, with calculated moves that had forced every faction to reconsider their own positions. They had been outplayed, and there was no going back. The summit had begun with tension, with the expectation of war. Now, it was a quiet room of uncertainty. The Shautari were questioning their military posture, the Vernaxes were lost in their intellectual debates, and the Kalir were struggling to understand how their very essence had been manipulated. And Earth? Earth had not just survived the summit. It had won. It had become the new center of galactic diplomacy. Its quiet mastery of strategy and emotional intelligence leaving no room for opposition. In the quiet aftermath, the factions were left to ponder the new order that had emerged. They could not deny it. The galaxy had changed. Earth Union had shown them that diplomacy was not just about power, but about understanding the very core of each species' existence. It was about anticipating their every move, seeing through their every weakness, and exploiting it without ever raising a weapon. Solvik turned to leave the summit hall, his expression still unreadable. But as he stepped through the doors, he knew the galaxy would never be the same again. Earth had carved its place at the center of galactic diplomacy, and the other factions would have to reckon with that truth. Whether they admired Earth's quiet brilliance or feared it, they would no longer be able to ignore it. The galaxy was now in Earth's hands, and the next chapter had just begun. The quiet hum of the Galactic Council chamber had settled into an uncomfortable stillness. The display screens flickered, casting an eerie light over the gathering of once mighty factions who now found themselves displaced, humbled, uncertain. Ambassador Reinar Solvik stood at the center of it all, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the view outside the window of the council room. From this high vantage point, the vastness of space stretched endlessly before him, a silent reminder of the power Earth now wielded. The galaxy had changed, and Solvik had changed with it. He had become a legend. But legends came with a cost. He had won, not by raising arms, but by understanding the pulse of every faction, every species. Yet even in victory, the weight of Earth's new role in the galaxy pressed heavily on his shoulders. There had been no glory in this triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that Earth's place among the stars was now cemented. And yet, there was a lingering question in his mind. Was it worth it? Solvik's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice, a familiar one. "Ambassador Solvik," said Velar, the Shautari warlord. The words were cold, but there was a strange respect underlying them now, a respect born of defeat. "You've turned us inside out. The Kalir may have bowed to your subtle manipulations, and the Vernaxes now question their very philosophy. But tell me, at what cost? You've made Earth a power, but is it truly a victory if no one trusts you to wield that power?" Solvik turned slowly, his movements deliberate. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in as Velar's words hung in the air, but he did not flinch. He did not need to. He had long since stopped being afraid of the power games the galaxy played. "The price of strategy," Solvik replied, his voice steady, "is that it is often misunderstood. What you call manipulation, I call foresight. What you call a weapon, I call a bridge. Earth has made its position clear. We will not fight every battle. We will not strike first unless absolutely necessary. But when the galaxy calls upon us, we will not be found wanting." Velar's mandibles twitched in frustration, but he did not interrupt. Solvik continued, his gaze not leaving the warlord's sharp, angular face. "The Shautari seek honor in battle. But what is honor when you cannot see the battlefield for the smoke? You think in terms of blood and steel. I think in terms of clarity and time. You see power in brute force. I see power in knowing when to wait, when to move. Earth's power is not in its military might. It is in its ability to anticipate, to understand. We've been preparing for this moment for centuries." The room fell silent, the weight of Solvik's words sinking in. Velar seemed to grow smaller in the presence of such certainty, but he did not challenge it. Solvik had made it clear. Earth's quiet strength had already won the war for them. There would be no bloodshed. Not today, not tomorrow. But that did not mean there would be no cost. As Solvik turned his attention to the Vernaxes, Tharion, their leader, stepped forward, his thoughts clearly in turmoil. His species had always prided themselves on their intellect. on their ability to sift through every moral dilemma and ethical debate. Yet Solvik had shown them that their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. Their intellectual posturing had been torn apart by Earth's sheer will to do the unexpected. "You've reduced our greatest minds to nothing more than pawns on your chessboard." Tharion spoke, his voice trembling with a mixture of resentment and reluctant admiration. "What you've done, it's not just diplomacy, it's something else. You've reshaped the very fabric of our thinking, Ambassador, but at what cost? Have you thought about how this will play out in the long term? Will the galaxy ever trust Earth again?" Solvik's eyes hardened, but there was no anger in them, only an indifference born of understanding. "You misunderstand me, Tharion. I've done nothing but offer clarity. The galaxy cannot afford to wait for philosophers to argue every point into oblivion. It needs decisive action, not endless debate. We are not in this for approval. We are in this to ensure survival. We've earned our place among the stars, not through force, but through intellect and strategy." Tharion recoiled, the weight of Solvik's words sinking into the depths of his intellectual pride. The Vernaxes had been outsmarted. There was no longer any room for debate. They had been forced to confront their own limitations, and it stung like a slap to the face. The Kalir, who had remained largely silent throughout the summit, now exchanged uneasy glances. Their energy-based existence had always given them a sense of invulnerability, but they were beginning to realize that Earth's subtle influence extended even into their own domain. The way Solvik had played on their sensory manipulations, their very physical form, it was a mastery that not even the Kalir could comprehend fully. Azrix, their leader, finally spoke, his energy fluctuating in waves of uncertainty. "We were blind, Ambassador. We thought you were just another player, a footnote in the larger struggle for control. But now, I see, we are no longer the only ones who can manipulate the forces of the universe. Earth has done the unthinkable. You've outmaneuvered us all. I would almost call it genius, if it weren't so disconcerting." Solvik regarded the Kalir leader with quiet understanding. "Every species is vulnerable in its own way, Azrix. You and your people manipulate energy. But true power lies not just in that manipulation. It lies in knowing when and how to wield it. That's what Earth has learned. We may not control energy as you do, but we control the very fabric of how this galaxy will move from now on." The Kalir fell silent. They knew now that their energy-based prowess was no longer unmatched. Earth had not fought them with brute force, but with foresight, with strategy. The room was still. The factions that had once stood on the brink of war now found themselves recalibrating, shifting, questioning their own roles in the galaxy. Solvik had led them to this moment, and now they had no choice but to accept the new reality Earth had crafted. They could no longer ignore Earth Union's strength, not its military might, but its ability to outthink them all. And so the galaxy had changed. Earth had not been the conqueror it had been assumed to be. It had been the quiet architect of its own destiny, moving unseen in the shadows, pulling the strings with patient precision. As Solvik turned to leave the chamber, the silence was deafening. The galaxy had learned a hard truth. Earth was not a minor player in the cosmic game. It had become the game itself. The price of strategy had been steep, but Earth had paid it in full.